10 years of begging for scraps of love. My name is Eleanor and I'm 71 years old. Before I tell you what my daughter said to me the week of her wedding, I need you to hear this first. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Because it's the only part of the story that matters. I called my lawyer that same afternoon, and by the time the sun went down, I had changed one name in my will. Just one name. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. But it was the name that mattered most. If you're watching this from somewhere quiet tonight, somewhere with a cup of tea going cold beside you, tell me where. Of begging for scraps of love. Drop your city in the comments. I'd like to know I'm not the only woman my age sitting up late. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Turning over the question of how much a mother is supposed to give before giving becomes disappearing. Because that's what this story is really about. Not a wedding. Not money. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It's about the moment a mother has to decide whether love means saying yes to everything, or whether real love, the kind my husband and I built a whole life on, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, sometimes means drawing a line and standing behind it, even when your own child is the one asking you to cross it. Let me take you back to where this started. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, so you understand exactly how far I traveled to get to that lawyer's office. My husband Thomas and I met in 1976 at a real estate licensing course in Scottsdale, Arizona. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Two nervous 20-somethings sitting in folding chairs in a hotel conference room, both of us hoping to make something of ourselves in a business neither of our families understood. Of begging for scraps of love. He proposed to me 11 months later in the parking lot of the very building where we'd taken that course, no ring box. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, just a ring in his coat pocket and his hands shaking worse than mine. We married in 1978, 44 years together before a stroke took him 3 years ago. Of begging for scraps of love. On a Tuesday in his armchair, a crossword half finished in his lap, I worked for 31 years as a title and escrow officer. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The person who sits across the table at a closing and makes sure every signature, every deed, every transfer of ownership is exactly what it claims to be. Of begging for scraps of love. I have read more property records than I can count. I know what a legitimate document looks like, and more importantly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I know what one looks like when somebody is hoping you won't read it too closely. That skill sat quietly in the back of my mind for years after I retired, gathering dust. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Until the week it mattered more than anything else I'd ever learned. Thomas and I built one thing in this life that we were both proudest of, more than the properties. Years of begging for scraps of love, more than the savings, the house. A rambling adobe-style place in Paradise Valley that we bought as a wreck in 1989 and spent a decade restoring by hand, room by room. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Weekend by weekend, Thomas laid the flagstone patio himself. I chose every tile in the kitchen. We raised our daughter, Jessica, in that house. It is not our biggest asset, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It is our only irreplaceable one. 3 months before he died, Thomas asked me to sit with him in his study. He'd already had one small stroke by then, from her scraps of love, and I think some part of him knew what was coming. "Eleanor," he said, taking both my hands, "promise me something. If anything happens to me, don't let anyone talk you out of this house." 10 years of begging for scraps of love, not for a good reason, not for a bad reason, not even for Jessica. People will come to you with kind faces and real needs, and you will want to say yes because that's who you are. Of begging for scraps of love, say no to anything that touches this house until you've slept on it 7 nights. 7 nights, Eleanor. Promise me. I promised. I thought at the time, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that I was promising to protect myself from strangers. I never imagined the person I'd need that promise for most was our own daughter. Jessica was 29 when her father died, of begging for scraps of love. Working as an event coordinator, sweet and scattered, and always a little behind on rent. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The kind of daughter who calls you crying over a parking ticket and then makes you laugh so hard you forget why you were annoyed. We were close, not perfectly close. Of begging for scraps of love, not without our friction, but close in the way that matters. Sunday phone calls, holidays spent together, her key still on my ring even after she moved out. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. 14 months ago, she met Connor A. Hale at a corporate event she was coordinating. He worked in what he called private equity advisory, though I never once heard him describe 10 years of begging for scraps of love in plain language what that actually meant. He was handsome in the practiced way of a man who has always been told he's handsome. Good suits, good watch. Of begging for scraps of love. A laugh that arrived exactly on cue and never a second before. The first time Jessica brought him to Sunday dinner, he walked through my house like he was assessing square footage. Of begging for scraps of love. He asked how old the house was. He asked, with a smile so smooth I almost missed the calculation behind it, whether I'd ever considered what a lot like this would be worth if it were. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, in his words, updated to its full potential. I told him Thomas built every inch of it with his own hands. Connor smiled wider and said, "Sentiment is lovely." 10 years of begging for scraps of love. But it doesn't show up on an appraisal. I laughed it off. I told myself he was young and blunt and didn't know any better. I want to ask you something. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I want you to really sit with it before you answer. When did you first notice someone in your life measuring you by what you had instead of who you were? 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Because I noticed it that night, and I did what so many of us do. I noticed, and then I decided not to notice. Because noticing would have meant admitting something was already wrong. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Over the following months, I watched Connor work on Jessica the way a slow leak works on a tire, so gradual you don't see the flat coming until you're already stranded. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He had opinions about her friends, about her job, about how often she should call her mother. He had opinions about the house, too, dropped casually again and again. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Like stones into still water, your mom really should downsize. This place is a lot of upkeep for one woman. It's practically wasted space. 6 months in, they got engaged. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Jessica called me sobbing with joy, and God help me, so was I, because despite everything I'd noticed and dismissed, I still wanted this for her. I still wanted to believe. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The wedding planning started reasonable enough. Then, 4 months before the date, Jessica came to me alone, no Connor, and told me the venue they wanted had gone up in price. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And could I help? I said, "Of course, sweetheart, how much?" thinking of a few $1,000s. And she said $45,000. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. From a retirement account, Thomas and I built penny by penny across 4 decades so that I would never, for one single day of my old age, have to depend on anyone. Of begging for scraps of love. I want to be honest with you here, because this story only works if I am. I said yes. I wired the money within the week because she is my only child. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And because some old instinct in me still believed that if I gave enough I would earn back the daughter I felt slipping away one Connor-shaped comment at a time. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Thomas would have told me I was already breaking my promise before I'd even reached the wedding itself. He would have been right. 2 months before the wedding, the second ask came. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. This one arrived over dinner, both of them present, Connor doing most of the talking while Jessica stared at her plate. They'd found the house they wanted to buy after the wedding. Of begging for scraps of love. A beautiful place, Connor said, close to good schools, an investment property really, the kind that only appreciates. The problem was financing. Connor's business, he explained. 10 years of begging for scraps of love had capital tied up in ways that made a conventional mortgage complicated just now. What they needed, he said, looking at me with that easy, rehearsed warmth, was a cosigner. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, just temporarily, just until his numbers evened out. I told him I'd need to see the paperwork before I signed anything. Something in his face flickered. 10 years of begging for scraps of love there, and gone so fast I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Of course, he said. Of course, Eleanor. Whatever makes you comfortable. The paperwork never came. Not that week. Of begging for scraps of love, not the next. Every time I asked, there was a reason. The lender was slow, the forms were being revised, I let it go. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Because Jessica's wedding was 6 weeks away, and I did not want to be the mother who made her daughter's engagement about money and suspicion. I told myself I was being patient. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Thomas would have called it something else. The third ask is the one that finally cracked something open in me, and it came 4 weeks before the wedding. 10 years of begging for scraps of love at what should have been a joyful family dinner to finalize seating arrangements. Connor brought it up like it was already decided. He and Jessica had been talking to an estate attorney. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, he said, just doing some responsible long-term planning, and given how much upkeep the house required for a woman living alone, and given that Jessica was, after all, my only heir, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Wouldn't it make sense to add both their names to the deed now, just as a formality? Just so that if anything ever happened to me, there'd be no messy transition, no probate, no delay. Of begging for scraps of love. Jessica, he said, would be so much more at peace knowing her mother's affairs were settled before the wedding. I looked at my daughter. She did not meet my eyes. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Something in me went very still and very cold in that moment, and I want you to understand what that stillness felt like, because I think many of you watching have felt it too. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It is the sound of 31 years of professional instinct waking up all at once. I have sat across the table from 100 families trying to move a deed for the wrong reasons, begging for scraps of love. I know exactly what it sounds like when someone calls a life-changing transfer of ownership a formality. I did not argue that night. I smiled, and I said I'd think about it. Of begging for scraps of love, and I asked for a few days, and in those few days, I did not confront anyone. I did something else instead. I became very quiet and very watchful of begging for scraps of love, and I let them believe I was simply a slow, sentimental old woman turning the idea over in her mind. Years of begging for scraps of love. I want to pause here and ask you to subscribe if this story feels familiar to you in any way, because what happens next is the part I need witnesses for. Not because I'm proud of it, of begging for scraps of love. Because I need to know I wasn't the only one who had to become a detective inside her own family. That night, after they left, I sat in Thomas's study, in his old leather chair, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Worn soft in the shape of him, and I held the photograph we kept on his desk, the two of us, on the day we closed on this house, 33 years old and terrified and thrilled. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I asked him, out loud in an empty room, what he would have done. The house didn't answer, of course, but some part of me already knew. 7 nights, Eleanor. You promised me 7 nights. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I gave myself 7 days, and in those 7 days I did not sit still. I began, quietly, checking things I had every right to check. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I called the retirement account custodian and asked for a full transaction history, not because I suspected the $45,000 had gone anywhere strange, of begging for scraps of love, but because I needed to know exactly what I was working with. I called an attorney, an old colleague of mine from the title business named Diane Prescott, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, who had gone on to specialize in elder law and estate protection, and I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers do. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and then she said the sentence that changed the shape of the rest of this story. Eleanor, this has a name. It's called undue influence, and the law takes it very seriously, of begging for scraps of love, but only if you document it before you act, not after. So I documented. I kept a small notebook, the kind Thomas used to carry in his shirt pocket at job sites, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And I wrote down every request, every date, every dollar amount, every conversation, in plain factual language. I photographed the retirement withdrawal confirmation for scraps of love. I saved the text messages where Connor pushed the deed conversation, messages he sent to me directly, thinking, I suppose, that I was too old and too soft to ever show them to anyone. Of begging for scraps of love. And then, 3 days into my 7, I found the piece of paper that told me this was never about a wedding at all. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Jessica had left her laptop open on my kitchen counter one afternoon while she ran out to the car for something, and I was not looking for anything. I want to be clear about that. Begging for scraps of love. I was simply refilling her water glass when I saw, sitting right there in an open browser tab, a mortgage pre-qualification application, Connor's name, Jessica's name, and a third field of begging for scraps of love, already filled in, already typed, not hers, not his. My name listed as a proposed co-borrower on a property neither of them had told me they'd already put an offer on. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Dated 11 days before Connor ever asked me for a signature. 11 days. They had been planning this before they ever sat me down and called it a formality. I did not say a word. Of begging for scraps of love. I refilled the water glass, I set it down beside her chair, and I went home and sat in Thomas's study and did not sleep that night at all. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Here is where I have to be honest with you about something uncomfortable. I did not confront them the next morning. I did not confront them for another 2.5 weeks. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I let them believe I was still thinking it over, still the trusting, doting mother. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, while I quietly finished building the wall that would protect this house and everything Thomas and I had built. I smiled at Sunday dinners. I helped address wedding invitations. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I let Connor pat my hand and tell me not to worry about paperwork. We'll sort it after the honeymoon. I became, on the outside, exactly the soft, distracted, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, easily managed woman he had decided I was. Dianton, I worked fast and quiet, because Thomas had, years earlier, placed the house into a revocable living trust in both our names, of begging for scraps of love. With a successor trustee provision, I already had more protection built in than Connor understood. What I needed to do now was make it airtight, of begging for scraps of love, and make sure it could never quietly be undone by a signature obtained at the wrong moment, in the wrong mood, on the wrong night. Begging for scraps of love. Diane drafted an amendment naming an independent co-trustee, of begging for scraps of love. A safeguard clause requiring any change to the trust's beneficiaries to be reviewed by an attorney and witnessed outside the family, and at my specific request, a single of begging for scraps of love. Quiet change to my will's contingent beneficiary designation, moving the house in the event of my death. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, out of Jessica's sole and immediate ownership, and into the same protected trust structure with clear conditions attached. Not disinherited, protected. There is a difference. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and it mattered to me enormously that I never crossed the line from protecting my daughter to punishing her. One name, changed on one document. It felt, when I signed it, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, like setting down something I had been carrying wrong for months. The wedding was 9 days away when Connor finally lost patience with waiting for my slow old woman deliberation. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He called me directly, without Jessica on the line, which itself told me something. Eleanor, he said, his voice pleasant in the way that had started to make my skin crawl. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. But our lender needs the co-signing finalized by Friday, or we lose the rate lock. I need you to come by the title office tomorrow and sign. Of begging for scraps of love. I told him I'd had the documents reviewed by my own attorney and that I would not be signing. The silence on the line lasted 4 full seconds. I counted them, then his voice changed. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Just slightly, the warmth still there but thinner now, stretched over something harder underneath. I think there's been a misunderstanding about what family means, Eleanor. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Jessica and I assumed we could count on you. You assumed wrong, I said, and I hung up. He came to the house that evening, and this was the first climax of this story, the private one. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the one that happened in my own kitchen with no one else to witness it but the two of us, and I like to think some quiet echo of Thomas standing in the doorway. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Connor did not raise his voice. That was almost the worst part. He sat down across from me at the same table where we had once discussed seating charts and told me, calmly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that Jessica would be devastated to learn her own mother didn't trust her. He said the word family 4 times in 6 minutes. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, each time like a key he was trying in a lock that no longer fit. This house, he said, is supposed to be for family. Your husband built it for family, didn't he? He built it for us, I said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, not for you. Something flickered across his face, fast, and I understood in that instant that I had just said something true enough to actually wound him, and that underneath the polish, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Connor Hale had never once expected an old woman to say no and mean it. I told him I loved my daughter more than anything on this earth, and that loving her meant I would not let anyone, of begging for scraps of love, including him, spend down the safety net her father spent 40 years building. I told him the trust was locked, the will was amended, of begging for scraps of love, and that no further conversation about this house would take place unless my attorney was present. Then I asked him to leave. He left. But 3 days later, at the rehearsal dinner, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. In front of both families, he tried again, publicly this time, and that was the second climax, the one with witnesses. He raised a toast, glass in hand, and somewhere in the middle of it, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Dressed up as sentiment, he said it. He said, Eleanor has always understood that this family takes care of its own, hasn't she? And he looked right at me when he said it, daring me, of begging for scraps of love. I think to smile and nod along the way I had for months. I did not smile and nod. I stood up instead. My hands were steady. I want you to know that, because inside I was shaking for scraps of love, but my hands were steady. I said that I loved my daughter, that I had loved her every single day of her life. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and that loving her was exactly why I would not be signing my late husband's house over to a man who had tried to obtain it through a mortgage application filed under my name. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Without my knowledge, 11 days before he ever asked me directly, the room went silent in a way I have never experienced before or since. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Then I did the one thing I had been saving for exactly this moment. I had brought Diane with me, seated quietly at the far end of the room as a family friend, and I asked her to confirm, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, in front of everyone, that the trust protecting the house had already been legally secured against exactly this kind of transfer. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and that the paperwork Connor had been pressuring me to sign for weeks would have made him a legal co-owner of a house he had never spent $1 or one weekend building. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Diane confirmed it, plainly, professionally, without a trace of theater. And in that confirmation, something in Connor's face finally cracked all the way open. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the mask slipping just long enough for the whole room, including his own parents, to see what had actually been underneath it. Jessica did not speak. She sat very still. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, staring at her own hands, and I watched my daughter's face move through something I can only describe as the sound a person makes when a floor they trusted finally gives way beneath them. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I want to ask you the question I've been asking myself since that night. When you finally see the truth about someone you love, does it hurt more, or does it finally, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, finally let you breathe? The wedding did not happen that weekend. Connor left before dessert was served, and by the following morning, according to Jessica, he had left for good. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, taking with him the easy warmth he'd never once had to work for, and, I suspect, whatever version of the future he'd been quietly building toward, without either of us fully knowing. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Here is the part I did not expect, the part that makes this story more complicated than a simple villain and a simple victory. 3 days after the rehearsal dinner collapsed, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, Jessica came to my house alone, and she did not come angry. She came broken and honest in a way she had not been in over a year. She told me she had seen the mortgage application too, of begging for scraps of love weeks before I had. She told me she had asked Connor about it, and he had told her it was just a placeholder, just paperwork, nothing to worry about. Of begging for scraps of love, and she had wanted so badly to believe him that she let herself believe him. She told me she had known on some level, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that something was wrong every single time he steered a Sunday dinner toward my square footage instead of my grandchildren someday. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She told me she had been too afraid of being alone again to admit what she already knew. That is not an excuse, and I told her so. But it was, at least, the truth. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I have come to believe that the truth, even late, even painful, is worth more than a lifetime of comfortable silence. She cried, and I let her cry. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And I did not immediately reach for her the way I once would have, because some new, harder part of me had learned something over those 7 days I never wanted to learn. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Comfort too quickly given teaches people that consequences are temporary. We are rebuilding now, slowly, 3 months out from that rehearsal dinner. Jessica comes to Sunday dinner again, of begging for scraps of love, alone, and we talk, really talk, in a way we hadn't in over a year. I have not restored the will to what it was before. I told her that directly, gently, but without apology. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I told her that forgiveness and trust are two different gifts, and that she has all of my forgiveness, freely given, but that trust is something rebuilt in small, visible, patient steps, of begging for scraps of love, not handed back whole because someone finally says they're sorry. The trust protecting this house stays exactly as it is for now. Not forever, I told her. Not as punishment. As proof, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, over time, of who she chooses to become now that no one is standing beside her, whispering about square footage. Last Sunday, of begging for scraps of love, she helped me clear out the last of the boxes in Thomas's study, boxes I had not been able to touch in 3 years. We found his old notebook, the one just like mine, and in it, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, in his handwriting, one line I had forgotten he'd ever written. This house holds us together, not the other way around. Jessica read it out loud, and then she looked at me and she said, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I understand now what he meant. I didn't before. I do now. I sat in his chair that night after she left, and for the first time since he died, the emptiness in that room felt different. Of begging for scraps of love. Not gone, just quieter, less like grief and more like company. I don't know if I did everything right. Some days I wonder if I should have said no the very first time. 10 years of begging for scraps of love before $45,000 ever left that account, before I let a smooth young man walk through my house, pricing it like a listing instead of a home. For scraps of love. But I have stopped asking myself whether I was harsh enough or soft enough or right enough at every single turn. I've started asking a different question instead. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the one I think matters more. Did I keep my promise to the man who built this house with his own 2 hands? And the answer, finally, after everything, is yes. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If there is one thing I would want you to carry away from an old woman's story tonight, it is this. Forgiveness is not the same as trust. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and you are allowed to hold both at once without feeling cruel for it. You are allowed to love someone with your whole heart and still tell them no. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, protecting what you built, is not selfishness. Sometimes it is the last best act of love you have left to give the people who will inherit it after you. Of begging for scraps of love. Thank you for sitting with me tonight, wherever you're watching from. If this story found you at the right moment, I hope it reminds you that it is never too late. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and you are never too old to change one name and change the whole rest of your story with it.